Every story needs a plot, and part of the plot is a time and a location. If I were to tell you a story, and it was set in Philadelphia in 1776, what would you think that story was about? Yeah. Right? Or if I told you a story and it began on an airplane on September 11th, 2001, what would you think that story's about? Right? You're good at this. We're all so groomed and conditioned. We do this by second nature, right? It's just we know how to read stories. It's built in. And yet, when it comes to the gospel, we have been, unfortunately, conditioned to not read it in its social context. Because this story that Charlie just read for us begins with Caesar Augustus calling for a census. And yet, we live in a time where many people say that Jesus wasn't political. I was raised to think that Jesus wasn't political. In fact, every time the church does get political, people say, nope, separation of church and state. Don't make this political, right? And yet, our central story, our framing narrative is set in a time and a place that was deeply and thoroughly political. How do I know? Caesar Augustus, the emperor of Rome, called for a census, which is a tool of empire. Do you know that census is a tool of empire? The imperial powers always want to know who they have and where they're located. So they know what to do with money and policing and so many other things. Census is an inherently political thing. So it's impossible for us to read our Christmas story and say, I don't see any politics here. Caesar Augustus called for a census. That's politics. It would be like if I was telling you a story and I said President Andrew Jackson declared that all Native Americans had to be on their original reservation. And you'd say, I don't see the politics there. He's president! It doesn't get more political. This is how occupying forces work. And yet, when we come to the Christmas story, we have sanitized it. We've cleaned it up a little bit. We've sterilized it. And we've made it non-political. I told you I was excited about this sermon, by the way. In fact, the unfortunate thing is that as the gospel traditions have been translated through different languages, whether they came through Latin, right, or the King James, and then they came into everyday English, they have been sort of depoliticized so that you and I can read the gospel story to children and it doesn't seem like a threatening story, and we can put images on Hallmark cards and no one thinks, this is really, how dare you? It's because we have neutered or defanged the gospel. But this story is so subversive. It means to make trouble for the government. This is a challenge. It is a revolt from the powers that be. So many things that happen in our gospel story are borrowed or hijacked terms from Rome, from the Roman Empire. For instance, the word gospel isn't original to the church. It's a borrowed term. The very term gospel belonged to Caesar. And the gospel was, hey, guess what? You've been conquered. Good news. This is the evangelion, right? The evangel. Good news. You now belong to me. Behave or there'll be trouble. That was the good news of Caesar. You're part of us now. Get used to it. So when the gospel writers, who were oppressed under this reign and rule, they took that little term and they said, that's not good news. Let me tell you what good news is. There was another king, right? This made Herod nervous. There was another king who was born in a manger and has a vision for a world that works very differently than Rome. An un-empire. And they borrowed terms. For instance, do you know that Caesar was called the Son of God? That's another borrowed term. The Evangelion. Even our idea of the second coming or the return of Christ, also a borrowed term. The parousia, or the parousia, some people say, is when Caesar would return back from victory, and as he's coming into the city, everyone would go out to greet him. The second coming is the whole imagery is borrowed from Rome. It is a welcoming back the victor. And the early church hijacked that and called it Christus Victor. Every single thing, almost, that they saw happening through Rome, they plucked it and twisted it and gave it new meaning. The good news itself, the Evangelion, the gospel, the idea of the Son of God, the reign and rule, even the idea of the kingdom of God, that's a subversive term. Because it basically says the reign and rule that God's looking for is going to unseat Rome, the kingdom of God, which is an unkingdom or an anti-kingdom or a counter-kingdom, a revolution to subvert and undermine the powers that existed. The gospel is through and through political. Some of you are thinking, interesting trivia. Why are we talking about this in Advent? Well, because the theme of the second week of Advent is what? Yeah, peace. Well, guess what? There already existed an idea of peace called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And there was a saying in the day of the people who had been conquered by Rome that they make a desert and call it peace. You know, we have a political leader these days who talks about bombing certain places back to the Middle Ages, making a desert and calling it peace. These are not different politics. So when we talk about peace, it is somewhat fraudulent or ignorant or fantasy for you and I to say, grace and peace be to you, when we are at war. We've been at war for 19 years. So for the church to every week say, peace, peace be with you, it would actually be better for us in some prophetic way during the passing of the peace to actually greet each other by saying, happy war, happy war, and reminding each other we are at war. But we have so outsourced our military and our foreign policy that we put it far away. We don't show the bodies coming back from the battlefield, and it is so sanitized and cleaned up that you and I forget we're even at war, because for most of our families, we haven't had to make those sacrifices. And these indefinite wars linger on with no sign in the near future of them ending. Not this Christmas, and not any Christmas coming up. So what does it mean for us to say peace? You know, there's an Old Testament verse that says, you say peace, peace, but there is no peace. The prophet says. What would it mean for us to dream of peace in 2020? What would peace look like? And here's the problem. It's deeply political. Asking the question, what would peace look like, is inherently political. Which is why voting for the Democrats or the Republicans is never enough and will not bring peace on earth and goodwill towards men. We need a different kind of politics. Because you and I have been conscripted into a rigged system where we think that these two parties are the solution. No! The gospel, the good news, is inherently subversive to the systems of this world. And so if you and I, as the church, think that voting one party line or the other is going to fix what is broken around us, we have been tricked into voting for empire. We're voting for Rome. Peace be with you. Oh, you're not offering peace back to me. Peace be with you. Oh, thank you. I received that. But when we say peace, what do we mean? If we mean the absence of war, we don't have it. But peace isn't just the absence of war. Peace has to be about the ability for humans to prosper in community. And so when we say peace, if we don't mean divine connection that unleashes human potential for flourishing and goodness, we have settled for a compromised, distilled, watered-down version of peace. And no wonder it's nowhere on the horizon. When Jesus talks about peace, he isn't talking about Pax Romana, the peace of the Roman military. When Jesus talks about peace, he says, the peace I leave you is not the peace of this world. It's shalom. It is an active engagement in the circle of life that connects us all. It's not the absence of violence. It's not the absence of bloodshed. That's making a desert and calling it peace. No, God's peace is a divine connection, a web of life where everyone has their best chance to prosper. And unless we are working for that in 2020, we don't have the right to say to one another, peace be with you. In February, we're going to start a study during Sunday school called The Church of Us versus Them. And the reason I want to have that conversation is, I don't know if you're aware of this, next year's an election year in America, and I desperately want to be a part of the solution and not contribute to the problem. Happy war? Come on. Peace. Shalom is a deep and grounded, rooted investment in the web that connects each of us so that everyone, old and young, wealthy and poor, black and white, gay and straight, Christian, and everyone else, everyone has their best chance to prosper. And then we can say, peace be with you, because we are active, working agents of the shalom, the un-kingdom, the anti-empire, the counter, to subvert and undermine, even corrupt and disrupt the systems of this world, to say there's a better way. And the way this world is now is not the way it has to be. Let's work together to bring about a greater good. I hope that you will dream this Advent, dream of 2020, and open yourself to being a part of the solution and not contributing to the problem. That's my prayer for us today.